Mormonism is a religion of being voluntold to do things. The fifth article of faith says, quote, "We believe that a man must be called of God, by prophecy and by the laying on of hands, by those who are in authority, to preach the gospel and administer in the ordinances thereof." End quote. Mormon congregations are run by volunteer lay clergy, meaning that people are selected from among the congregation without any special qualifications or training to staff the various positions in a local church. And it's believed that those people are chosen by revelation from God to fill that position, which is called a calling. This can make it kind of difficult to refuse a calling. There's a lot of self-imposed pressure and cultural pressure to accept any calling that's extended to you, even if you're not qualified for it in any way, shape, or form. Because it's also taught that God will qualify you. That said, because Mormonism is also a religion with very firm social norms, if someone starts to push against those norms, even if well-intentioned, there can be some pretty dramatic pushback, and a person can be very suddenly released, or is it fired, from their calling. Just like what happened to my wife, the Masked Mistress. Welcome, friends, enemies, and everyone in between, to my channel, The Masked Mormon. I am, of course, the Masked Mormon.
Why are you wearing a mask? Were you burned by acid or something like that?
Oh no, it's just they're terribly comfortable. I think everyone will be wearing them in the future.
I am a Mormon who did everything that the church asked of me. I attended church for 3 hours, when it was that long. I attended seminary, I served a mission, I got married in the temple, I paid tithing, and served in whatever calling was asked of me. What's more is my wife, the Masked Mistress, did this also. Today, I'm going to tell you about the story of how she got fired from a calling. So let's get into it. But before I actually do that, before I actually get into that story, let's give a little background for those of my viewers who may not be as familiar with the Mormon Church. In the opening, I quoted the fifth article of faith, and the church, at least institutionally, takes this very seriously. On a local level, wards and stakes are staffed by unpaid lay clergy. Everyone from the bishop to the elders quorum president to the teachers to the nursery leader are all volunteers who staff these positions without getting paid. A stake president or bishop will have a day job doing any number of things. Then, on top of his family and job responsibilities, is also tasked with running a stake or a ward. On Friday, you may visit your local dentist. Then on Sunday, this same dentist may be leading the elders quorum, or teaching the kids, or counting tithing money. During the week, a driven lawyer may be leading her local relief society on Sunday, or she might be in charge of the primary. In some ways, this can seem quite egalitarian. Any person, if it's a man, may lead a ward. Any woman may have the chance to lead the young women's organization, the primary, or the relief society. Now, there can be a lot of opportunities for responsibility and growth by having some of these callings. In addition, the more prominent callings can come with a lot of social capital and regard from the Mormon community. A bishop may be recognized by his title for years after his release. Some callings come with a great deal of responsibility and opportunity to make a large impact, for good and for ill, on the lives of others. Bishops, Relief Society presidents, Elders Quorum presidents, Young Women's presidents, primary presidents, and teachers may all leave a lasting impression on those who they are tasked to lead or to teach. Those impressions can be positive and encouraging, or they can sometimes be quite destructive. And because it's believed that these people are literally called by God, there's also a belief that God will give them the tools and the discernment that they'll need to fulfill their responsibilities. So there is little, if any, training or instruction that's given. They may be told to review the relevant sections in the General Handbook of Instructions, and then they are turned loose to do their thing. And so long as that person toes the line of orthodoxy and doesn't rock the boat, there's very little oversight. Now, I will admit, it can be quite validating to be asked to fill a prominent calling in the church. It's almost as if God somehow is confirming that you're on the right path. Church leadership will claim that there are no small callings. A bishop can be released one week and then be called into the nursery on the next. Though this may be true in principle, often, for men at least, there is a progression. For instance, a man might serve as an elders quorum president for 3 or 4 years. Then he could be elevated to a counselor in a bishopric. After a couple years of doing that, he may be called as the bishop. He will serve in that for about 5 years. Then, after that, he might be called as a high counselor in the stake for a few years. And if he is sufficiently church broke, he could be called as a stake president, which he'll serve for the next 10 years. If he doesn't make it that far, he could have several repeat positions, all of which have high visibility and social prominence. A man who doesn't have as much social capital, or who isn't as church broke, or who is unwilling to serve in some of these high demand callings, may be a teacher in any of the classes that need to be taught, or otherwise limited to lower level callings. He may be a clerk or secretary. A woman, on the other hand, is more limited. She could be called to lead the children in primary, or the young women, or the Relief Society, or also possibly a teacher. And like I said, as long as you toe the line of orthodoxy and defer to the leaders above you and keep a temple recommend, which includes paying tithing, the church is content to allow you to continue serving in that position until they decide you should serve somewhere else. And for some, that is in positions of higher influence and authority. My callings have included gospel principles teacher, missionary, temple worker. Then when I was on my mission, I served in all of the leadership positions available. I was a ward mission leader, a Sunday school secretary, an elders quorum president, and I think the last thing I was a scout leader. By the end of my stint as an elders quorum president, I was in the midst of my faith crisis. My wife, the Masked Mistress, also held several callings in her time in the church, several with high levels of prominence. She served as a missionary in Salt Lake City. She and I served as co-ward mission leaders in our married student ward. She had several positions as secretary in primary and Relief Society, which is something she enjoyed. She has always liked working behind the scenes. Unlike me, she has never really been one to want to be in the spotlight. Now, one of the last callings that she held, which coincided with her own faith crisis, was as a counselor in the Young Women's Presidency. Her responsibilities were to help the president, an older woman, as she led the young women's classes and activities. Young women consist of girls between 12 and 18. She would also occasionally teach Sunday classes to these young women. One thing that she really wanted to do was to help the scriptures become more applicable in their lives. She wanted to make the characters in these stories feel more real and human, more relatable. They were covering the early chapters of the Book of Mormon. And if you have never read the Book of Mormon, the characters in the stories can seem very two-dimensional. The good guys are melodramatically good, and the bad guys are melodramatically bad. They were going over the story of a character named Nephi. He is the protagonist of the first book in the Book of Mormon. He is the third oldest, having 2 older brothers. When their father tells the family that they are going to flee into the wilderness, these older brothers complain about having to leave their home and belongings behind. They understandably aren't too happy with the situation, but Nephi believes in their father and his prophetic visions. He even has visions of his own. As you read the book, these brothers consistently serve as antagonists to Nephi's goodness. Nephi is elevated to position as an example of faithful obedience in the Book of Mormon. Many young people in the church are told to have the faith of Nephi. But If you were to live in a family with someone like Nephi, you would recognize him as a zealous, holier-than-thou jerk. You may have even been a Nephi, where you were quick to point out how unrighteous those around you were, and by pointing out how peers aren't following the rules. Such a person can get a lot of positive attention from church leaders, but on a personal level, they are insufferable. They are judgy, quick to criticize, and frankly, no fun to be around because they suck the joy out of everything. I have known a few Nephis, especially at BYU. For example, not long after my wife, the Masked Mistress, and I got married, we had one of my freshman friends and her husband over for dinner and to watch a movie. This wasn't long after the film National Treasure came out, which, as ridiculous as it is such a fun movie. And it should be noted that this movie is rated PG, not PG-13 or R, but PG. But her husband said that he refused to watch the movie. Now, we were really confused, and in a condescending tone, which may or may not have been intended, he said that the movie portrayed stealing in a positive way, so they wanted to avoid the appearance of evil. Like, WTF, are you serious? Now, I ultimately didn't push the issue, but it really irritated me and rankled my frustration. And it obviously made an impression on me because some, 20 years later, this is pretty much the only thing I remember about this man. I am sure we have all known this type of person. I'm sure at times we may have even been this type of person. Now, I get it. In trying to fully live the principles of Mormonism, it's easy to get overly zealous on things. And as my wife, the Masked Mistress, was teaching the young women, she was trying to humanize the characters of the Book of Mormon. And she pointed out that Nephi was likely hard to get along with. Many of his interactions with his brothers show Nephi to be a bit of a jerk. Now, she didn't dwell on this point too long and moved on to the rest of her lesson, which, from our discussions as she was preparing it, was pretty great. It was an outside-the-box type of lesson that could help the girls relate differently with the scriptures and apply the lessons in the stories to themselves in novel ways. But the other leaders in the room were really uncomfortable that my wife, the Masked Mistress, called a prophet of God a jerk. Whew. They tried to backpedal the lesson a little, but my wife, the Masked Mistress, had already started to move on. Even after the lesson, as we talked about it, it sounded like it went really well. She did tell me about calling Nephi a jerk, which is a sentiment I fully agreed with. The more I read the Book of Mormon, the more I realized Nephi was not a person that would be pleasant to be around, especially if he gets his hands on a sword. Well, apparently behind the scenes, my wife, the Masked Mistress, really kicked up a hornet's nest. You see, it's not okay to criticize figures in the scriptures, prophets, or even real-life church leaders. In the words of the number 2 leader in the church, quote, "It is wrong to criticize the leaders of the church, even if the criticism is true," end quote. Well, my wife, the Masked Mistress, ran afoul of this moray because she was released as quickly as possible. Within a week, a new person had been called in her place. She had been fired from a calling. Now, no one actually talked to her about it, but because she said something edgy, she was seen as dangerous and couldn't be let to remain in her position. Now, a believer might say, well, this sounds reasonable. After all, she criticized one of the most celebrated heroes of Mormonism. Now, at this time, she was still believing, but she was in the opening phases of her own faith struggle. And ultimately, no one came to talk to her about it. No one tried to ask her to clarify her position, or to understand why she said what she did, or even try to correct her. Instead, She ran into a common Mormon tactic: avoidance of an issue. While smiling to her in her face, they moved to release her. She was very invested in these girls, and she was getting her feet under her in this calling, only to suddenly have everything pulled out from under her. And the church's response to things like this can sometimes be very inconsistent. As I was beginning my own faith crisis a couple years before, during my tenure as an Elders Quorum president, someone overheard a conversation I was having with someone when I said something along the lines of course the church isn't true. That doesn't really make sense. Instead, the gospel is true. Someone informed the bishop that I had said, the church isn't true. Admittedly, an edgy comment. But he sought to understand what I meant, and we had a conversation about it. And he said I should be more careful about what I said. But ultimately, I wasn't released from my calling. Now, I don't know if the difference was because I was a man, or just the nature of the people involved, or if there was something else involved. But if you want to get out of a calling quickly, it seems all you really have to do is criticize a prominent Book of Mormon character. Have any of you been suddenly released from a calling? What were the circumstances around it? Did you want to be released from a calling, but the leaders wouldn't do it? Let me know down in the comments. And if you like what I do, please press the like button and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.